Counselor Allen, as well as Auditor Maroon. So my understanding is there's a presentation that you guys have created. So I guess I'll turn it over to you and you can go through that.
Okay, let me start by thanking you all for the opportunity to work with the city again this year. I'd like to thank Brad O'Connor and his staff too for helping us get through the audit. The support was certainly appreciated. With that, I will take you through what we did for the city and the results of those services. Joining me today from my team is Keely Hines and Jacob Skevel, and they will help me with the presentation. So we'll flip right over to part A, which is the scope of services performed. We did an audit of your financial statements. Although we assist in putting those financial statements together, the numbers are yours. Our job is to give an opinion on those numbers, and we'll talk about what that opinion is in a second. We also did 2 single audits, an audit of the expenditure of your federal awards, and also an audit of the State of New York Department of Transportation awards. Flipping over to part B, our summary. So this is the part where we go through what we did and what the results are. We issued an unmodified opinion on your financial statements, which is the highest level of assurance that we can give you, meaning we believe your financial statements are free of material misstatement, also known as a clean opinion. Had we come in and the records were in a state where we couldn't give an opinion, we would issue a disclaimer of opinion. Or if there was something that we disagreed with management on and management decided not to make changes, we could also issue what we would call a qualified opinion. But I'm happy to report that we have an unmodified opinion this year, which is exactly what you're looking for. In terms of internal controls, we're required to look at the design and effectiveness of your internal controls. We did note a deficiency in internal controls that we deemed to be a significant deficiency. We'll talk about that when we get to the findings section. There are 2 levels of findings that we report, a material weakness and a significant deficiency. A material weakness is a deficiency which we believe would likely result in a material misstatement of your financial statements. We did not have any material weaknesses this year. We'll go over the details of that deficiency a little bit later on in the presentation. Flipping on to the next page, one of the things we always talk about is audit adjustments. In prior years, we've had a significant number of adjusting journal entries, meaning we came in and we proposed journal entries that were required to keep the financial statements from being materially misstated. Fortunately, we did not have any adjusting journal entries this year. We did have some immaterial adjusting entries that we look at, and we pull them all together to see if they could rise to the level of a material audit adjustment. In this particular year, we did not feel that that was the case, so we did not book those audit adjustments. We're also required to kind of have a scorecard about what happened during the audit. As I think most everyone knows, the target was to issue this by December 31st. We missed that goal by a little bit. There were 2 things that I thought you should be aware of with respect to that. The first bullet there was related to access to Peoplesoft, which is sort of critical for us to do some of the testing that we do. We had requested that in August. We didn't actually receive that access until December. That was sort of obviously a roadblock for us to completing the audit in the time frame that we had hoped for. Second thing that happened was in our review of the regional airport authorities financial statements, We did find an error that needed to be corrected by their auditor and of course their management. We pointed that out in December. The actual revised financial statements were not received until February. That caused a bit of a delay for us too. With regard to single audits, the 2 single audits that we did, with respect to the federal programs, we looked at 3 programs as major programs: the lead program, CDBG, and home, all HUD programs. With respect to lead, we did have a qualified opinion on compliance, and we'll get into the details of that finding a little bit later on, but it was related to reporting. There's 2 types of findings. There's internal control findings with respect to federal awards, and then there's compliance findings. This was a compliance finding. With respect to the other 2 programs, we issued clean opinions or unmodified opinions, no issues there. And relative to the New York State DOT single audit, we looked at the CHIPS program, and we did not have any findings with respect to that. So again, Part C is key financial highlights. And you know, these are key financial highlights from our perspective. Again, these are your numbers. We're just going to point out some things that jump out to us, and you know, of course, anyone could ask questions about that, and then we'll go over the findings. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Jake, who's going to take you through those financial highlights.
Good morning, everyone. We're going to start with the highlights on the government-wide financial statements. The page numbers you'll see throughout here reference the pages in the financial statements themselves. So if there's anything you see in here that you want to see further context or information on, that is where in the financial statements you can go to find some further details. So starting with your government-wide statements, statement of net position and statement of activities, these statements are going to include all of the assets and liabilities of the city, and they do include the Syracuse City School District numbers blended in. The statements are on the full accrual basis of accounting, similar to what you would see in private sector companies, and all of the current year revenues and expenses are included regardless of when the cash transactions occur. And what you'll see for these figures is they do not necessarily reflect the budgetary basis of accounting that you'd more typically use for your purposes. So the city's total net position is a deficit balance of about $812 million at June 30th, 2020. Of that, the governmental activities represent a deficit of about $824 million, while the business type activities represent a positive balance of about $12 million. And a major contributing factor here of the large deficit is the recording of the net pension liabilities and the OPEB liability for retiree healthcare. For June 30th, 2020, the total pension liability included is about $157 million. That does include, for the school district, a pension asset at June 30th of about $30 million. In the business type activities, the pension liability is about $6 million. And for reference, the actual contributions paid into the pension plan systems for the year ended June 30th were about $45 million. Moving on to the fund financial statements, which the governmental funds use a current financial resources measurement focus. So this is more in line with the budgetary basis that you would be looking at. Or in the cases of the proprietary funds and fiduciary funds, those still use the economic resources measurement focus, which more mirrors the government-wide financial statements. So for the year ended 2020, the city's general fund was expected to use about $8 million in fund balance, and the school district's general fund was expected to use about $16 million in order to balance the budgets. For the 2020 year end, the city's general fund had a decrease in fund balance of about $10 million, and the school district general fund had an increase of about $12 million. That surplus for the district is consistent with what most school districts saw for the 2020 year, and as with some of the shutdowns resulted in savings for the school districts for this year. For the city's general fund, looking at the fund balance, we like to point out there's further classifications of what that fund balance represents. First, you have the restricted fund balance that's restricted by external users. And then the unassigned and assigned fund balance are really what are under the city's control, with assigned fund balance at the city primarily being assigned for the purposes of appropriations in the next year's budget. So of that $9.9 million decrease for 2020, the unassigned fund balance decreased by about $11 million, and the assigned fund balance at June 30th of 2020 was about 1.1 million higher than the prior year. And like I said before, that is primarily due to increased appropriations for the 2021 budget. Factoring into some of that activity for the city's general fund was a decrease of about $3.9 million in sales tax revenues from the prior year to about $85.4 million for the year. This was below the budgeted amount for 2020 by about $7.5 million, or about 9.3% under budget. Alternatively, expenditures in the general fund were about 17.9 million less than the final budget for 2020, which was a 7.7% favorable variance. We have a couple charts in here for informational purposes to reference. The first represents unassigned fund balance year over year from 2014 to present, which the unassigned fund balances really represents the savings account of the city. So you'll see for the last few years from 2017 to 2019, that was trending upwards with a decrease from 2019 to 2020, which is in line with what we'd expect based on the results. I will also point out here that it's not including the assigned fund balance figures, which again were about $9 million at June 30th, 2020, and just about under $8 million as of June 30th, 2019. Also included here is year over year general fund revenues and expenditures, which similar to the fund balance were trending up. And like we said, with the activity of the decreased revenue and spending under budget for expenditures, there was a drop in both for 2020 as compared to 2019.
So I think before we head over to the findings, maybe we should open it up for any questions about the financial statements themselves.
I don't know if any of my other colleagues have anything, but I don't have anything in that section.
Okay.
You're referring to just the last few statements?
Yeah, I think we're just at this point talking about the numbers before we head into the findings.
I'm just curious if there's any way the remark that the bulk of the 800 million deficit that we see is is pension. Do we know specifically, how much when we say, much of the projected 800 plus million is projected pension and stuff. Do we have a separation between what is projected and actual and what is other things?
Yeah, so when we're talking about the government-wide financial statements and that giant deficit, I'm just going to find you the number real quick, but those are basically all actuarial estimates. So on an annual basis, that's why we always throw in there that, all right, on an annual basis, you paid 43 million for pension. The bulk of it actually is that retiree health.
Greg, I have that here. The liability June 30th was about $749 million. Right. And then again, the pension net liability on here at June 30th was about 157 million.
Gotcha.
And relative to that retiree health, I think the actual benefit payments was about 29 million for the year. So again, wide disparities. Those long-term numbers are what you would expect to pay, for instance, for retiree health for both your retired employees and your active employees. So we're projecting everything, based on what we know right now. So again, it's a number that you need to know, but it's not a number that you're necessarily going to manage your budget by, because you're going to look at those annual contributions and what you're projecting for the next couple of years.
Right. Got it. Thank you.
Does that help?
Yes, it does. It does. Makes sense.
Any other financial statement type questions? Okay. With that, we'll talk about the two findings that we have, and Keely will walk us through those.
Good morning, everyone. So our first finding is related to 2020-001.
I'm sorry, it's really hard to hear you.
Is that better?
Yeah, a little bit.
Okay. So finding 2020-001 is a significant deficiency related to the financial statements. So if you recall, Greg had mentioned no material weaknesses. We do have a significant deficiency, and it has to do with the lack of centralized oversight and review over grants. It's a critical component of your financial reporting to ensure that those reconciliations are happening within the grant reporting. So when you're receiving grants and expending those grants, it's important to know whether you have received advances or whether you've actually expended funds in which you anticipate subsequently receiving a reimbursement through the grant. So we identified an instance of the latter, in which the city within the water funds had expended just under $500,000 that a revenue and a receivable was not recorded to reflect that expectation that would be funded through a grant. So again, this is not a material misstatement, but important enough that we felt it was noteworthy for you folks to be aware of this, and certainly without taking proper corrective action going forward, this could result in a material misstatement if these reconciliations are not happening. Any questions on that particular point?
Yeah, so is there a specific recommendation that like other municipalities do for internal controls over this that the city should be specifically looking at?
Yeah, I think typically what we've seen, and I'll use the county as an example of them pulling together a financial, I forget what they call it, but financial integrity unit, I think, or something. But basically, they look at all of the grants together, and they have a group of people that are sort of cross-trained in all the departments to review those grants and make sure they're maximized and that the grant reporting is correct. I think that's hard to do when you have individuals in separate departments trying to manage that. And certainly turnover hurts when that happens.
Ultimately,
Councilor
you could
Green, this is,
go ahead, Counselor.
sorry, but I'm just a little confused on how what was just explained as a deficiency or an inefficiency is not a material weakness. But that was the very definition of a material weakness, was an inefficiency in reporting.
So that materiality calculation is based on the amounts in those funds. And it just sort of works out that 400,000, although it is a big number and it's an important number, is not material to that particular fund. And that was the only instance that we found where we were looking at adjustments. I mean, that's just unfortunately government accounting, government auditing. Those are definitional type things that we have to follow in our reporting.
I may have a follow-up question at some point because I don't know if that cleared it up anymore than it did before. You know, I've been here for a while, and I've seen what you guys have qualified as material weaknesses in the past. So maybe I'm missing something, but I'll hold any further questions for later.
What may be helpful is if you take a look at your financial statement on page 98 is page 2 of our report on our audit performed in accordance with government auditing standards. And if you look at the third line on that page 98, it will nicely define what a material weakness is. And again, as Greg had mentioned, this is explicitly laid out in the standards. And it says a material weakness is a deficiency or combination of deficiencies in internal control, such that there's a reasonable possibility that a material misstatement of the financial statements will not be prevented, detected, or corrected. And because this dollar amount did not, in fact, meet that material threshold, which again is dictated by the standards and calculated on an annual basis on each of your opinion units, this misstatement did not rise to the level of a material weakness, but was important enough to direct your attention to it and therefore met the definition of a significant deficiency.
Okay, Counselor, now you got me, now I'm more confused. What would you do? I mean, we've been a client of yours for a while, right? Is that correct? The city has. So what would you do?
1996, I believe.
Yeah, I know. I seem to remember the first go around at the city council. I remember you bringing up this almost the same things. So what would you do if in your report, and I looked through your report, what would you do if you had a client that continually and historically has problems keeping track of grants? Do you point that out, or
yeah,
you're
absolutely.
pointing it out now, but would you say something like, you know, we've been doing this for years, and year after year you have problems monitoring and accounting for your grants?
Yeah, absolutely. And this particular comment relative to centralized oversight has been in there, you know, in various forms, you know, since I've been involved in 2000. So yeah, I think it's fair to say it has been out there.
Well, maybe you should highlight it in yellow or something. Maybe that'll help out. I mean, because I remember seeing this the first go around, and I have a history with the city parks department. The parks department always had trouble keeping track of the grants. So
right.
I think that's somewhat what Counselor Bay was getting at too. So it's a material weakness then, correct?
Well, I think in this particular year, it's not a material weakness because it wasn't as pervasive as it's been in the past. We haven't had to book those journal entries.
Well, absolutely, because we didn't get a chance to spend the grants, obviously, because of the COVID crisis.
That's correct.
Yeah. Okay. So we did good because we did nothing, or better, rather. And that's all I got. Thanks, Councilor Green.
Counselor, I have to disagree with you that we did nothing. The entire internal control structure was revamped over the last 12 months, and we put considerate effort towards this grant accounting.
Oh,
And so
Brad,
the results are very different than they ever have been in the past.
Brad, I know you're a thin-skinned Irishman like I am, but I didn't mean anything about you and your department. I'm saying as far as spending the grants and all that, we did less as far as the projects go because we, obviously because of COVID. And that's what I'm trying to get over.
Yeah,
I think you've done a great job.
Thanks.
Any other questions on this? Okay.
Okay, and then we'll move on to finding 2020-002. So this is a finding that corresponds specifically with the single audit. So just recap again, the single audit is the audit that we do in accordance with uniform guidance, and this is specific on your federal expenditures. And the LED program includes reporting requirements that are dictated by the compliance requirements, and they are in fact directing material to the city, and the city failed to complete that reporting by the due date of July 30th, 2020. The reports were ultimately submitted in December of 2020, but we have to report on the fact that one of the compliance requirements, in this case reporting, was not in compliance as it relates to the LED program.
I'm curious if anyone who can speak to the LED program can comment on that. Is this the issue that we talked about clearing finances to get construction work done and the holdup there? Is anyone on who can speak to that?
I can speak, secondarily to it, and this is based on a conversation I had with NBD. They ran into some issues when COVID started, just being able to get a hold of people with the state, and so they're telling us that actually delayed their submission because they weren't getting responses from the state when people started going remote.
And this was the reporting that was delayed. Was this in work done on properties?
Yeah, it was related to the annual report of expenditures. So there's two things that happen. There's quarterly reports that are filed. Those were filed on time, but then there's the last report, which is the annual report. Obviously, the culmination of those quarters, which was not done.
And the unfortunate part is this is the same program that was, I imagine it's the same program, maybe it's under a different title, but it's the same program we had trouble with under the previous administration where you lost our lead funding, correct, Jacob or Greg, or anybody's got any kind of historical knowledge?
Yes, yep, this is the same program.
So if any program we should have underlined and thought about was particularly this program, because I think we lost it for 2 years, if I'm not mistaken.
No, it was
funding.
It was longer.
Was it?
It was about 5
longer?
years. It went out.
Okay, 5 years.
2013, I believe.
Well, I left the council. I was 3 years in hiatus there. I was, Councilor Driscoll. So,
Yeah.
yeah. Okay.
But so
That's all.
I'm just trying to clarify a little bit further if I could. So the quarterly reports came in on time, but the end of year reporting was not done on time because of, according to the city, was delaying getting cooperation from the state.
That's right. And I don't have the specifics. It was really just classified as general communication issues that delayed the flow of the information back and forth.
And how long was the delay?
The communication delays, I'm not entirely sure on the details. The report was ultimately submitted in December.
Okay.
We can get some more details on the specifics of the delay for you.
Yeah, my apologies. I'll follow up at another time. Please continue.
Other questions on this item? Okay.
Okay, great. Moving forward to Part E, upcoming pronouncements. So GASB 95 was issued and released with an effective date of an immediate effective date upon issuance. And what that meant was in May 2020, GASB 95 resulted in the delay of implementation of GASB 84 and 87. So 84 related to fiduciary activities will now be adopted by the city for the June 30, 2021 year end. So those changes will be reflected in the next set of financial statements that you receive. And the short of it is on your financial statement, beginning on page 27, is your fiduciary funds. The city has agency funds, and then included in that same financial statement is the school district's agency funds, as well as their private purpose trust funds having to do with their scholarships. So under this pronouncement, the school district will also be required to evaluate those two sets of funds and determine under this new pronouncement whether the activity and transactions within those funds still meet the definition of fiduciary. And we will assist the city in addressing that same concept with the agency fund. We have some implementation guides that we have been providing our clients that can help with the definition and determining what types of items will have to come out of those agency funds and meeting now the definition of the governmental activities. So we will work with Brad in the coming months during this off season to get those adjustments made so that your statements are in fact in accordance with 84. Any questions on that particular statement? Okay, and then GASB 87 will be June 30, 2020 or 2022, excuse me. And this will have to do with lease accounting. This standard will require that a leased asset will be recorded offset with a liability amortized over the terms of the agreement. Again, we have some implementation guides and a tool that we'll share with Brad so that any contracts and agreements the city is a part of.
You muted yourself.
And we will work with the city to make sure that that can be implemented properly and those contracts and agreements that meet the definition of a lease are in fact recorded as such.
So again, this is just the Government Accounting Standards Board kind of moving things around in your financial statements, which quite frankly causes more of a headache for us than it does for you. But certainly we're on top of it, and we'll make sure that you guys are compliant in your reporting. So that's all we have for the required communications. Again, we'll take any questions that you might have. And certainly appreciate your time today.
So I guess the first question I had is the delay in Peoplesoft from August to December is obviously very long time. So what's the story there and what happened?
Brad, do you want to comment on that? I mean, certainly we asked and we asked and we asked, and you know, it was just not much of a response, I think was the issue.
Yeah, I don't have a ton to add beyond that. You know, I know there were some challenges the IT department had because previously the auditors accessed Peoplesoft on-site, and obviously they're not allowed to do that, so they need to be set up with remote access. So a little bit of a curveball this year that the IT department hasn't had to deal with it in the past. Other than that, I'm not entirely familiar with the details enough to comment.
I guess going forward, is there a way to have someone in the administration tell IT this is an important thing that we want them to handle in shorter time than 4 months?
Yeah, I think the goal here is just to start working on them in June. I hate to say it, that's only a few months away, but you know, it is sort of critical, and we don't know where we'll stand from a remote perspective. So yeah, I think our goal is to start even earlier.
Councilor Green, can I ask a question?
Go ahead.
So, unfortunately, or fortunately, I'm not as old as Councilor Hogan, but I do have a little historical perspective. So when I came on the council in 2010, I asked, and Greg has heard me say this ad nauseum, I don't understand why a business enterprise of $250 million is not able to produce their external audit until 8 months, almost sometimes 9 months from when the fiscal year ended. It doesn't, in my opinion, allow the administration or the council to appropriately have the time to digest mid-year transfers and an external audit, and then look at forecasting what the upcoming fiscal year budget might be. And so the delay of 4 months from the IT department doesn't really serve the taxpayer well when the external auditor can't complete their work in a timely fashion. We've been trying to get this for 12, 13 years that I'm aware of, to have this audit completed by the end of December. Now, the school district has been able to accomplish that, and yet the city has not. Part and parcel was 1 year because the school district was hacked, so that delayed, I don't know, 3 to 5 weeks in terms of the reporting. The prior also was, which I had discussed with the mayor when I first came on board, was the airport authority was delayed in doing and reporting out their audit. We had every assurances, I believe, that they were going to be able to deliver this year. And yet again, they had a 2-month hiatus from when our external auditor pointed out an error in some of their documentation. And it took 2 months to get that updated, which, as Greg has identified, caused a delay. So I think from the point of our taxpayers, we deserve better than this. And in my role as a city auditor internally, seeing some of the things that, while this while this external audit looks at kind of an overview for finance purposes as it reports to the single audit to the federal government, and looks at issues that would affect credit ratings, bond ratings, and those kinds of things. I won't say a lot. I will say there are issues relating to internal purposes that affect the city's ability. And I know this administration has been trying to address some of these issues by centralization. And yet, 3 years into it, as we talk about the grants management program, that has, as Councilor Hogan identified and Councilor Bay, those have been outstanding for many years. And Greg, you mentioned it as well. So my point being is, what are we going to do to improve our ability to be successful on behalf of the taxpayer to get this external audit done, certainly by December of the year that we end our fiscal year, within 6 months of when we end a fiscal year? I just, Greg, I don't know if I'm you or Frank, I don't know, or Brad, it just seems baffling to me that we can't do better.
Yeah, I can answer that, Auditor, and I agree with you 100%. February is unacceptable. Last year, March was unacceptable. You know, April the year before was unacceptable. We are trying to turn the Titanic here, and we inherited decades of mismanagement that we're trying to correct overnight. So, you know, I was here for part of the fiscal year under audit. Mike Canizero, our accounting director, was here for, I think, a month and a half of the year under audit. We didn't have time to correct the inputs throughout the year. So our focus for this audit, you know, Keely, you know, when she was discussing material weaknesses, she said it is lacking controls that would either prevent or detect and correct material misstatements. We couldn't prevent because we weren't here. So our focus was on detecting material errors and correcting material errors. We did that to a certain degree of success. Still some work that needs to be done there, but we're now shifting our focus to preventing errors. It's a much broader task that really needs cooperation from the entire city. You know, it's incredible how many people touch financial transactions of one sort or another. Anyone that fills out a time card is touching a financial transaction that's covered by this audit. So it's a extremely broad undertaking to correct these internal controls that you know, go different levels into every department, including finance. By the time it gets to finance, a lot of the preventing error has already passed, and when it gets to finance, we're now into detecting and correcting error. We're going to focus a lot of our efforts, and we've actually we've hired a Deputy Commissioner of Finance over financial operations. This is the first time the city has had somebody of this caliber that's overseeing departmental finances. So we're deploying this person into the finances to drill down and figure out where are these errors occurring when they start, rather than wait for them to get to the Bureau of Accounts. Let's correct them from the beginning. If we can go through that process with all the departments, with all of the financial transactions and functions, by the time it gets to the Bureau of Accounts, it's going to be a much easier job. And our reconciliations, rather than recreating the wheel starting June 30th, it's really just going to be a check. It'll be a check that the numbers are right, the transactions are right, and we'll be able to pass it on to the auditors a lot quicker. The auditor's review will be easier because they know that the details have been vetted and streamlined in a more efficient manner. There's still a lot of outside factors. You know, I don't know how we get the airport's auditors to act quicker, but you know, we've got a lot of work that we can do, and we've got a plan to do that work internally. And you know, I want to get to the point where we are issuing before December 31st, and anything within our control is done on time to facilitate that.
Well, Brad, first of all, I appreciate and respect what you and your team are doing, and that's an improvement from 75 to 100, whatever journal entries we had previously in doing the audit, so that you've minimized that and done a great job with that. But when you talk about the airport, they are required by authority law within 90 days of the end of their fiscal year to have their audit completed. End of story. That's the authority law. So that should be accomplished by September. It should not be February of the following year, which holds up the city's audit. That's inexcusable. The school district, which is another component of ours, a part of our audit, they have been working to accommodate it. And I think they've done some of the same things that you've identified by having an internal auditor doing some of the work so that they're prepared, as you've just outlined for us. And I applaud you for what you're trying to do in the team. And I know Frank has talked about the centralization, but I think, it points out when there's a 4-month delay from the IT department to our external auditor, when there's a 20-year history of grants management, and when you look at how delayed we are, it's totally unacceptable. The taxpayer deserves better. That's my bottom line.
Yeah, auditor, let me reinforce what you just said. It is unacceptable. It is also 20 years. It's probably more than 20 years. This comes down to 3 things and let me just extract from what Brad said, because Brad is much more articulate about this than I am. I'm going to simplify it. It comes down to 3 things. It comes down to people, it comes down to systems, and it comes down to centralization and control. We have the people in place now, and they have done an extraordinary job in a very short period of time. I have every expectation that they're going to continue that work, and there's a lot of work that still needs to be done. The system we do not have. The system, our core system, the system that runs the city's finances is not in any condition to run a $250 million enterprise. Brad inherited that, Mike inherited that, Matt inherited that. They are working to do everything from fix the GL to fixing the transactions. And that's not an easy thing to do. You're building the airplane while it's flying. And again, there is a long way to go. Believe me, there are a number of things that Brad hears from me on a regular basis that I remain exceedingly frustrated that we are unable to do or accomplish. But we're getting there. And I have every confidence that we are moving in the right direction. And yes, you mentioned that I've talked about centralization. We have centralization of most, but not all, of the city's finances. Those were decisions that were made. I don't know who made those decisions. I wasn't here and I wasn't paying attention as a citizen. But somebody made the decision years and years ago to decentralize much of our finances and much of the oversight of those finances. And so we have shadow accounting departments and shadow accounting departments and shadow accounting systems embedded in our 3 largest departments. And that meant that what the centralized accounting department received was essentially batches of information bunched together and no ability to provide much oversight to them. And it takes time to unwind that. So your frustration is exceedingly well placed. I can't say anything other than you are correct. We are not going to be able to solve it, and I don't want to pretend that we are overnight, but we have come a long way, and that is primarily thanks to Brad and the team that he's assembled. The fact that we have an external audit with no material weaknesses, frankly, I had no expectation of that. It's been my major objective. It was probably the first thing I said to Brad when he came on board. I didn't think we were going to get there until next year. The fact that we got there this year is a huge testament to Brad and the team that he's assembled and the work that they have done. But we have a long way to go yet as a city and as a finance team.
Frank, if I could interject right here, I'm sorry to cut you off, Nader, but you know, the clock ran out on you. I'm sorry, buddy. No, I'm only kidding. Frank, you know, I think you do have a team in place. I think with Brad and Tim Rudd and a bunch of people, I think you got a team in place. But I'm not, and I'll just say this as an old hand, is that this is about leadership. Because all those department heads, they're the same level as Brad. You're going to have to like basically tell them how it's going to run. And that's the part of the Titanic that Brad was talking about, moving it around. You don't want to hit an iceberg here. I mean, this is a thing that's got to become from the top. Otherwise, I mean, it's completely unacceptable that they couldn't do this by remote in the 21st century as far as the Peoplesoft things. And it's completely unacceptable that a grant that we once lost is a grant that we're not reporting on correctly. I mean, so things have to be done. So how long should we give you, Frank? What do you think?
How long for what?
To turn this Titanic around.
Give me a few $1 million and a whole bunch of people and let me rebuild the Peoplesoft system.
Oh, I think you're going to need people who actually know finances as far as internal controls go. I mean, because I know how it works in city departments. A lot of time, a person's been there a long time and might be running recreation programs at McChesney, and all of a sudden they've been there a long time. They want to come inside the office, and all of a sudden they're doing personnel and finances. So
I absolutely agree with you, and I think the centralized finance team is the team that we need. Grants, we are not where we need to be on grants. We don't even have the Peoplesoft grants module turned on. The decision was made, the decision was made by previous. Once we turn that module on and bring it in, yes, but we've been we're working on the payroll system, which the decision was made years ago not to use the Peoplesoft payroll modules, human capital management modules. We've reversed that decision. We're bringing that in. Yes, we have on our roadmap, we will bring the grants management in as well. So there's a significant amount of work to be done. We've got timelines for each of those individually. They're not easy, they're not short, and they're not inexpensive.
okay, thanks. I'm sure you'll be hearing from Councilor Green on this and the rest of the Finance Committee regarding maybe some sort of a timeline or maybe something that we pointed out in this audit. But I appreciate what the people have done as far as this audit goes. And some of these issues are long-standing, but I think it's about time we correct them, especially since you got this new team in place. So
yeah, we agree, 100%, Councilor. Thanks.
And Councilor Hogan, I'd be happy to go over some of the details about our centralization plan, because I think you hit the nail on the head. Historically, we have asked non-financial people to take on financial roles, and the centralization program essentially is putting those types of transactions back in the hands of people that are qualified to handle those types of financial transactions.
And I'm not criticizing those folks. I mean, they've done it because it was their duty to the city, and a lot of times other things weren't approved as far as positions go and all that. I mean, they did the job they could do, but it's about time we stepped in the 21st century as far as those things go. So it was tough for me to step in the 21st century, I'll tell you that.
Yeah, the operative word with you was old. But so what about the airport authority and that, Brad? I mean, where do you see, how do you involve yourself with them and for them to be compliant so that Greg and his team can work?
Yeah, so the airport authority had quite a bit of turnover in the spring and into the summer. And the finance director that was out there for years, I would say probably decades, retired in the spring. She was replaced with a new CFO who wants nothing more than to get all of this right. And you know, she has certainly held us accountable when we were a hold up to her accomplishing what she needs. I have little to no doubt that by next September, she'll have all of the issues ironed out and they'll have an audit issued before the September 30th deadline.
And Frank, if I could, one more question, Councilor Green, if I may. So the issue of the 4-month delay from the IT department for the remote access to Peoplesoft, I appreciate the burden that you are all under with Peoplesoft. When I was a counselor, I was against it from the very beginning. It wasn't set up for municipal government, and in my opinion, I did my research 10 years ago on it. But so what do you see as what we can do to be able to not have a 4-month delay for our external auditor from our IT department so that they can do their work? How do you see that working? And I realize and respect the IT department's been strained because of all of the COVID and all of us working from, well, some of us working from home and some of us here in the office. But what do you see the answer to that is?
Again, it's completely unacceptable, Auditor. I mean, there's no two ways about it. And we need to, whether we're working remotely or we're working on site, the auditors have to have access to the information. It used to be that we didn't deliver the GL in time, and that the auditors waited for that. And the finance team has rectified that, I think, significantly, shortened that. Did they wait this year? Yeah, they waited this year, but they didn't wait even remotely as long as they have in the past. They have to have system access. We have to be able to provide it. We need to have the systems in place to be able to do it. Again, it's people, it's systems, it's centralization. And we're trying to do all three of those simultaneously. This is relatively, in the scheme of things, something that I feel we can control and fix virtually immediately. I don't know what the underlying problem was, but you can be darn sure I'm going to find out as soon as this meeting is done. But the other things that we've talked about today are, I want to be clear, are time and money sensitive. This is not.
Thank you, Councilor Green. Thank you, Frank. Brad.
So we're coming up on an hour here. Any other questions from councilors before we close this up?
Just real quick before we wrap, I'd love to get more in depth on the lead issue. I don't know, Brad and perhaps someone from MBD, if we could get an email thread going out to set up another meeting, I'd love to follow up on that and learn more about it.
Yeah, I'll do that.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else? Okay. All right. Well, thank you all very much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody.